The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval battle of World War II and by some criteria the largest naval battle in history, with over 200,000 naval personnel involved. It was fought in waters near the Philippine islands of Leyte, Samar, and Luzon from 23 to October 26, 1944 between combined American and Australian forces and the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN. It was part of the invasion of Leyte, which aimed to isolate Japan from the colonies that it had occupied in Southeast Asia, a vital source of industrial and oil supplies. Prior to the main engagements, Admiral Kurita, who was the main Japanese naval commander, had planned to knock out the USA once and for all. To do this, he sent every available ship in Japan's arsenal to the Philippines to stop the American advance. His plan Shogo 1 consisted of 3 forces. Shogo 1 called for Admiral Ozawa's ships, known as the Northern Force, to lure the main American covering forces away from Leyte. Northern Force would be built around several aircraft carriers, but these would have very few aircraft or trained aircrew. The carriers would serve as the main bait. As the USA's covering forces were lured away, 2 other surface forces would advance on Leyte from the west. The Southern Force under Admiral Nishimura would strike at the landing area via the Surigao Strait. The Center Force under Admiral Kurita, by far the most powerful of the attacking forces, would pass through the San Bernardino Strait into the Philippine Sea, turn southwards, and then also attack the landing area. To get to the islands of Leyte, Samar, and Luzon, the Center Force had to sail through the Palawan Passage. Kurita's ships passed Palawan Island around midnight on 22 to 23 October. The American submarines Darter and Dace were positioned together on the surface close by. Once they detected the Japanese force, they were quick to attack. In a matter of minutes, the submarines attacked the force, sinking 2 Japanese heavy cruisers, the Maya and Atago, and damaging a third. The damaged cruiser Takao retired towards Singapore, and to the Japanese advantage was used as bait to lead the submarines out of the area, which worked and consequently ended the first stage of the battle. Despite its great strength, the Third Fleet was not well placed to deal with threat. On 24 of October, the USA located the fleet and began an aerial bombardment in the Sibuyan Sea. As the Americans attacked, the Japanese were quick to counterattack, launching all available aircraft. Despite the major disadvantages, a single Japanese bomber managed to slip past American fire and scored a hit on the light carrier Princeton, which after many hours of firefighting was scuttled by nearby ships. While all of this was happening, the Americans scored multiple hits on the super battleship Musashi and the heavy cruiser Myoko. The latter was forced to retire. After many more bomb and torpedo attacks, Musashi was sunk and for a short time became the world's largest shipwreck. Nishimura's Southern Force consisted of 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers. This task force left Brunei after Kurita on October 22, turning eastward into the Sulu Sea and then northeasterly past the southern tip of Negros Island into the Mindanao Sea. Nishimura then proceeded northeastward with Mindanao Island to starboard and into the south entrance to the Surigao Strait, intending to exit the north entrance of the strait into Leyte Gulf, where he would add his firepower to that of Kurita's force. The Japanese 2nd Striking Force was commanded by Vice Admiral Kyohei Chima and comprised of 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers. The Japanese Southern Force was attacked by USA Navy bombers on October 24, but sustained only minor damage, losing a single destroyer. The 2 forces were unable to meet up, consequently they entered the strait at different times. The Japanese Sea Force entered the Surigao Strait in the early hours of October 25 and was annihilated in a night engagement with destroyers and battleships of the U.S. 7th Fleet and the cruisers and destroyers of the Royal Australian Navy's Task Force 74. As the Japanese ships sailed north through the narrow strait, they were subjected to torpedo attacks from U.S. patrol boats and destroyers. The Japanese battleship Fuso was sunk, as were 3 destroyers. Despite having already lost most of his fleet, Nishimura pressed onward. At the end of the strait, 6 U.S. battleships were waiting for the rest of the force. Oldendorf crossed the T on Nishimura's formation, meaning that his ships were able to deliver a full broadsides attack with all of their big guns, while Nishimura could only employ his forward weapons. At the same time, USA Navy and Royal Australian Navy cruisers and destroyers on the flanks of the battleship line opened fire. The effect was devastating. Nishimura went down with his flagship, the battleship Yamashiro, and the cruiser Mogami was seriously damaged. Shima's second attack force had entered the strait some distance behind Sea Force, and the Mogami collided with Shima's flagship, the cruiser Nachi, in its attempt to escape. Showing no desire to fall into the same trap that had decimated Sea Force, Shima reversed course and withdrew. The action at Surigao Strait was one of the few naval battles of the Pacific War in which aircraft did not play a significant role. Kurita's first attack force, having passed through the San Bernardino Strait, moved southward along the coast of Samar. By this point, Halsey had shifted the Third Fleet to the north in pursuit of the Japanese decoy force. In doing so, he had left the American amphibious forces on Leyte woefully unprotected. With the bulk of the 7th Fleet engaged with Nishimura at Surigao Strait, all that stood between Kurita and the landing beaches were the ships of Taffy 3, a naval task force that consisted of just 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts under the command of Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. Kurita's armada had been whittled down somewhat over the course of the previous day's engagements, but it still remained one of the most powerful collections of surface ships to see action in the Pacific War. Displaying an aggression that sharply belied their underdog status, the 3 U.S. destroyers, led by the USS Johnston, launched an audacious torpedo attack that damaged the heavy cruiser Kumano and caused the Yamato to take evasive maneuvers that carried Kurita away from the battle. Although Taffy 3's carrier planes has been outfitted for close air support of the landing forces, they dominated the airspace above the Japanese ships and were eventually joined by aircraft from Taffy 2, another task force that was a short distance away. While Kurita's ships continued their cat-and-mouse pursuit of Taffy 3, they were subjected to nearly 2 hours of incessant aerial bombardment. With no aerial reconnaissance of his own to determine the makeup of the enemy fleet, and unaware that Halsey had taken the bait and moved his ships away from Leyte, Kurita believed that he had engaged a significant portion of the Third Fleet. Such was the ferocity of Taffy 3's attack that the Japanese identified the handful of U.S. destroyers as heavy cruisers and escort carriers were taken to be fleet carriers. 3 Japanese cruisers were sunk, a 4th, Kumano, was heavily damaged. With his fleet in disarray and not realizing just how close he had come to shattering the thin defensive screen around the Leyte landing beaches, Kurita opted to retire. In what was perhaps the unlikeliest naval victory of the Pacific War, Taffy 3 lost 2 destroyers, Johnston and Hull, and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts. The escort carrier USS Gambier Bay was sunk, becoming the only USA aircraft carrier of the war to be lost in naval gunfire, and the escort carrier USS St. Lo was struck by a kamikaze and sank shortly after the main engagement had ended. The St. Lo would be the first United States ship to be sunk by a kamikaze attack. During the night of October 24th to 25th, Halsey had moved the 3 battle groups of the 3rd Fleet north to meet the Japanese decoy force. To Halsey, the Japanese carriers represented a target too inviting to ignore. This, of course, was entirely the point. Among the ships in the decoy fleet was the Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier to have participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. Attrition had taken a significant toll on Japan's naval air force, perhaps most significantly at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and the 4 Japanese carriers, which were under the command of Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo, sailed with a little more than 100 aircraft between them. The ensuing engagement reflected the dramatic imbalance in power that now existed between the USA and Japanese naval strength, and the result was so lopsided that it was almost an anticlimax when measured against the action which was taking place simultaneously at Samar. Halsey deployed a total of 65 ships, Ozawa's force of 18 ships. Halsey also held an overwhelming advantage in air power. Not only were his pilots more experienced than the raw recruits that the Japanese were rushing into service, but just one of his heavy carriers boasted an air complement that equaled that of the entire Japanese decoy fleet. With little more than a token combat air patrol to defend it, the Japanese fleet quickly became prey to United States bombs and torpedoes. Beginning at about 8 a.m. and continuing for several hours, waves of Halsey's planes descended on the Japanese carriers, and in short order, all four, Chitose, Chiyoda, Zuho, and Zuikaku, had been sunk. Carrier aircraft and naval gunnery also claimed several destroyers and escort ships throughout the morning and early afternoon, but Halsey soon became aware of the drama unfolding some 400 miles, over 640 kilometers, to his south. The Japanese Navy's victory operation not only failed to disrupt the Leyte landings, it resulted in serious losses to what remained of Japan's surface fleet. Japan's total losses in the Battle of Leyte Gulf amounted to 3 battleships, 1 large carrier, 3 light carriers, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. In addition to this, United States submarines and aircraft managed to sink an additional battleship and cruiser while they were retreating to Japan. The United States lost 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, and several other vessels. The Imperial Japanese Navy had all but ceased to exist as an offensive force.